Have you ever heard the story of someone who holds onto their faith in an environment that opposes them? Imagine a young student facing a lecturer, not only highly intelligent but also a staunch atheist, who constantly challenges religion. This story takes place in France, where a Muslim student confronts a true test of faith during a tense debate at one of Paris's most prestigious universities. The philosophy lecturer, Madame Beatrice Lauren, was known for her deep skepticism toward religion. At 50 years old, she possessed remarkable intelligence and an extensive understanding of various schools of thought. To her, religion was nothing more than a cultural product, lacking absolute truth. In her classes, Madame Beatrice pushed her students to think critically, especially about religious beliefs. She often questioned the existence of God and dismissed prayer as futile. Among the dozens of students attending her lectures was a 19-year-old Muslim girl named Isabel Moria. She wore her hijab gracefully and carried herself with intelligence, calmness, and an unwavering belief in Islam, despite being in a secular environment. Isabel never hesitated to stand firm in her faith. That day, the classroom felt even more intense than usual. Madame Beatrice stood at the front, arms crossed, her sharp gaze sweeping over the students. "All right," she began, walking slowly toward the blackboard. "Let's discuss something interesting today." She picked up a piece of chalk and wrote the word prayer on the board. "You've all heard about prayer. Religious people believe it can change situations. But let's think rationally. If prayer truly works, why is the world still filled with suffering? Why do the poor, who pray fervently, continue to starve? If God hears prayers, why doesn't He stop great tragedies?" Some students nodded in agreement. In a country like France, where secularism is deeply rooted, such questions weren't uncommon. Many had already been swayed by arguments like these. But Isabel sat silently, her expression calm and unshaken. Madame Beatrice glanced at the class, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Is there anyone here who still believes that prayer has real power?" she asked, folding her arms across her chest. The room went silent. Students exchanged hesitant glances, but no one dared to speak. Then, with a soft yet confident voice, Isabel raised her hand. "I believe prayer has power," she said firmly, her gaze steady. Madame Beatrice raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh? You believe prayer can change something?" she asked, her tone laced with skepticism. Isabel nodded. "Yes, I do. But perhaps not in the way you imagine." A sarcastic smile spread across Madame Beatrice's face. "All right, Isabel. Explain to us how prayer can have a real impact, but spare us the emotional arguments. I want proof, not blind faith." The entire class turned toward Isabel, curious and expectant. Some looked doubtful. Could this Muslim girl really take on one of the university's most formidable atheist lecturers? Isabel took a deep breath. She knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about representing her faith in front of people who doubted it. "I will answer logically and scientifically as you requested," Isabel began, her voice calm. "But before I do, may I ask you something, madam?" Madame Beatrice leaned forward, intrigued. "Go ahead. You are a highly rational philosophy lecturer, but do you believe in the power of the mind?" Isabel asked. Madame Beatrice frowned slightly, then nodded. "Of course. The human mind is incredibly powerful. There are countless studies showing how our thoughts affect our health, our lives, even our success." Isabel smiled gently. "Then, do you believe in the placebo effect? How someone's belief in a treatment, even if it's just a sugar pill, can trigger real physical healing?" Madame Beatrice nodded again. "Yes. The placebo effect is a well-documented scientific phenomenon. When someone believes they're receiving real treatment, their body often responds as though they actually are." Isabel's eyes locked with hers. "Then what if I told you that prayer works in a similar, but even more profound way?" The classroom fell into a heavy silence. Some students leaned in, clearly intrigued. Madame Beatrice narrowed her eyes. Are you suggesting that prayer is just another placebo? A trick of the mind? Isabel shook her head. No, it's much more than that. Prayer isn't mere self-suggestion, it's a form of communication with God. It brings peace of mind, emotional strength, and yes, even real-world impact. But to fully understand that, we need to explore it more deeply. Her hands moved gracefully as she spoke, her mind carefully choosing each word. The room, once filled with skepticism, now sat in rapt attention, waiting for what Isabel would say next. Madame Beatrice hadn't expected Isabel to steer the conversation into deeper waters, far beyond the usual debates about the existence of God. But Isabel continued, her voice calm and confident. I know you don't believe in God, madam, she began. But let's look at something closer to the academic world. In psychology, there's a concept called neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change based on experience and belief. If someone prays regularly and feels connected to God, their mind undergoes real changes. It helps them stay calm, become stronger in facing challenges, and approach life with more optimism. Isn't that proof that prayer has a tangible impact? A ripple of whispers spread through the class. Some students exchanged glances, intrigued by Isabel's argument. Madame Beatrice gave a thin smile. Interesting, she replied. But that still falls under the realm of psychology. It doesn't prove there's any external force answering those prayers. Isabel nodded. You're right. And that's exactly what I'm about to explain next. The tension in the room thickened. All eyes were glued to Isabel and Madame Beatrice. No one dared to speak, as though any word might shatter the fragile air between the two debaters. This was no longer just a classroom discussion, it had become a battle of beliefs. Madame Beatrice crossed her arms again. Okay, Isabel, she said. You claim that prayer is more than psychological suggestion. I want to hear a stronger scientific explanation. Don't just talk about how it affects the human brain. Prove that prayer has a real influence on the world around us. Isabel's heart raced, but her face showed only calm confidence. She had anticipated this challenge. As an academic, madam, you understand the concept of energy, Isabel began. Einstein himself said that matter and energy are interchangeable. If everything in this universe is energy, isn't it possible that prayer is a form of energy too, one that can influence its surroundings? The class broke into whispers again. Some students leaned forward, trying to follow Isabel's line of thought, while others frowned, skeptical but curious. Madame Beatrice raised one eyebrow. That's a bold assumption, she said. But bold claims need strong evidence. Where are your facts? Isabel gave a slight smile. I'll present two types of proof. First, scientific evidence that can be measured. And second, real-life experiences, things that science struggles to explain but are no less real. Madame Beatrice leaned against her desk, folding her arms. All right, she said. Let's start with the scientific evidence. Isabel took a deep breath. She knew this was a defining moment, not just for herself, but for her faith in front of the entire class. There was a study conducted by Dr. Masaru Emoto, a Japanese scientist. Isabel began. He researched how words, intentions, and prayers affect the molecular structure of water. He discovered that water exposed to positive words or prayers formed beautiful, symmetrical crystals when frozen. In contrast, water exposed to negative words formed distorted, chaotic shapes. Some students murmured, visibly intrigued. Now, Isabel continued, think about this. Our bodies are made up of over 70% water. If prayer can change the structure of water at a molecular level, isn't it possible that prayer can also affect our bodies and lives in ways we can't fully understand? A few students nodded in agreement, the idea clearly resonating with them. But Madame Beatrice wasn't convinced. She smiled faintly, though her eyes now showed genuine interest. That study has been controversial, she said. Many scientists question its methodology. Do you have any other evidence? Isabel didn't flinch. She was prepared. Yes, she replied firmly. There's also the work of Dr. Larry Dossey, a physician who studied the effects of prayer on patients. In his research, he found that patients who were prayed for, even without knowing someone was praying for them, showed significantly better recovery rates than those who weren't prayed for. This was consistent, even when the patients and those praying were miles apart. This revelation caused a stir. Some students gasped softly, while others exchanged glances, clearly rethinking their previous skepticism. Madame Beatrice sighed, her expression now thoughtful rather than dismissive. So you're suggesting that prayer has real effects, even at a distance? Isabel nodded. Not just me. Science is beginning to uncover that there are forces at work beyond our full understanding. Prayer isn't just empty hope, it's a real connection, with real consequences. The room grew silent once more, but this time, it wasn't the silence of skepticism. It was the silence of minds beginning to open. But a power that can change things. Isabel's voice lingered in the tense silence that filled the classroom. Madame Beatrice was quiet for a long moment. Her face was unreadable, but Isabel could sense that her arguments had started to chip away at the lecturer's firm skepticism. Still, Isabel knew Madame Beatrice wouldn't yield so easily. The lecturer straightened up, leaning back against the desk, arms crossed tightly. Her sharp gaze locked onto Isabel. All right, she began, her tone calm but challenging. You've made some interesting points. But answer me this, Isabel. If prayer really works, why are there people who pray every single day yet still live in misery? Why do innocent children, who pray with pure hearts, go hungry? If God really hears prayers, why doesn't He answer them all? The question hung heavy in the room. A few students shifted in their seats, others glanced at Isabel, wondering how she'd respond. But Isabel didn't falter. She smiled softly, recognizing the question. It was one of the oldest arguments used against the idea of prayer. Madam, she said gently, may I ask you something? Beatrice raised an eyebrow. Go on. If a small child asked his mother to let him eat candy all day, would the mother say yes? Beatrice frowned, taken aback by the simplicity of the analogy. Of course not. That would be terrible for his health. Isabel nodded. Exactly. A wise mother wouldn't give her child everything he asks for. She'd give him what's best, even if the child doesn't understand it at the time. The class was silent, listening intently as Isabel continued, her voice calm and steady. It's the same with our prayers. We ask for things, but God, the All-Wise, knows what's truly best for us. Sometimes our prayers are answered the way we expect. Sometimes they're answered differently. And sometimes, they're delayed, because something better is waiting. Her words echoed through the silent room. Several students looked deep in thought, their expressions softening. Madame Beatrice studied Isabel carefully, clearly intrigued but still not ready to surrender. Her next question came more softly, almost personal. Tell me, Isabel, have you ever experienced the miracle of prayer yourself? Isabel inhaled deeply. She knew this was the moment to share something real, something that couldn't be explained with studies or theories. Yes, she said quietly. I have. And I believe many people here have too, even if they don't realize it. The class leaned in closer. Even Madame Beatrice seemed more attentive now. When I was a child, Isabel began, my family went through a really difficult time. My father lost his job, and we almost lost our home. We did everything we could to make ends meet, but it wasn't enough. Things just kept getting worse. Her voice trembled slightly, but she pushed on. But my mother, she never stopped praying. Every single night. And she would tell us, prayer isn't just about asking, it's about trusting. It's about building a connection with God, even when things seem hopeless. Isabel paused, her mind drifting back to those dark days. I remember one night, We had barely any food left. My mom gathered us in the living room, and we prayed together, not just asking for help, but truly surrendering to God. And the very next day, something happened. She smiled, her eyes glistening. An old friend of my father's showed up out of nowhere. He offered my dad a job, one even better than the one he lost. It was exactly what we needed at that moment. It saved us. The classroom was completely silent now. Not even a whisper. Madame Beatrice shifted slightly, her skeptical armor cracking just a bit. But what if that was just a coincidence? She asked, though her voice had lost its earlier sharpness. Isabel smiled. Maybe it could have been. Once. Maybe even twice. But when things like that keep happening, when prayers keep finding answers, it's not just coincidence anymore. It's a pattern. Madame Beatrice said nothing. Her lips were pressed together tightly, and the room felt heavy with unspoken thoughts. Some students sat frozen, deep in contemplation, while others exchanged glances, clearly moved. The silence stretched on, until Beatrice finally sighed, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. "All right, Isabel," she said, her voice softer now. "I'll admit, your arguments have weight. But there's still something that bothers me." She looked Isabel directly in the eyes. "If God does hear prayers, and chooses what's best for us, how do you explain?" Madame Beatrice hesitated, her hands clasped tightly together. "You know that I never believed in prayer. But after our debate, I found myself thinking about it more than I expected. I didn't want to admit it, but I tried, not exactly praying, but I thought about that wish, the one I told you about." Isabel leaned in, listening intently. Madame Beatrice's voice trembled slightly as she continued. "I wished for something I thought was impossible, to reconnect with my estranged daughter. We haven't spoken in years after a terrible argument. I never thought I'd hear from her again. But 2 days ago, she called me. Out of nowhere. She said she missed me and wanted to meet." Her eyes shimmered with emotion, something Isabel had never seen before. "I don't know how to explain it. It felt like more than just coincidence." Isabel smiled softly, her voice warm. "Sometimes, when the heart is open, answers come in ways we don't expect." Madame Beatrice shook her head gently, a conflicted smile on her face. "I'm still not sure what I believe, Isabel. But I can't deny that something changed. Maybe there's more to this than I thought." Isabel reached out, placing a gentle hand on her professor's. "It's okay, madam. Faith isn't always about having all the answers, it's about being willing to seek them." For the first time, Madame Beatrice didn't respond with skepticism or dismissal. Instead, she simply nodded, her heart and mind in quiet turmoil, on the cusp of a journey she never imagined she'd begin. "I have been trying to get a research scholarship for a very prestigious philosophy program in England," Madame Beatrice began, her voice trembling slightly. "I tried for years but always failed at the last moment. Eventually, I gave up and thought it would never happen." She looked at Isabel with tears welling up in her eyes. "But then, 2 weeks after our conversation, I received an email saying I was accepted, without any explanation. I hadn't even reapplied this year. It shouldn't have happened." Isabel smiled gently. "What's even stranger," Madame Beatrice continued, her voice quivering, "is that the night before I got the news, I woke up in the middle of the night feeling peaceful. For the first time in my life, I felt there was something greater than myself, something I couldn't explain." She looked at Isabel, her eyes filled with confusion. "What really happened, Isabel? Was it just a coincidence, or does prayer truly have power?" Isabel gazed at her with warmth and understanding. "Madam," she said softly, "you've witnessed how prayer can change what seems impossible. It's not because prayer is some magic spell that instantly grants our wishes. Prayer is a way to communicate with God. When we pray with sincerity, we surrender everything to Him. And when God wills something to happen, it will happen, even if the entire world says it's impossible. Madame Beatrice shook her head slowly. I don't know what to say. For years, I believed only in logic and science, but now, it feels like there's something more. Isabel smiled again. Sometimes the answers we seek can't be found through logic alone. Some truths can only be felt with the heart. Madame Beatrice looked up at the sky, now painted with shades of orange as the sun began to set. For the first time, she felt a calmness she had never known. After a long pause, she spoke softly. I want to become a Muslim. Isabel's face lit up with warmth. I would be honored to help you, madam. Faith isn't something that can be forced. It must be found with a sincere heart. Madame Beatrice nodded slowly. That day, two women from different worlds began a new journey together, a journey towards deeper faith and understanding. This story is not just about belief, it's about surrender and trust in God. Not everyone believes in the power of prayer, but for those who do, it can open the door to miracles. Sometimes, those miracles don't come in the form we expect. They come when we open our hearts and allow ourselves to see the truth that was always there. Thank you for watching this story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video so more people can find inspiration. See you in the next story. Welcome to the Legacy of Islam channel. Today, we will explore an extraordinary story filled with emotion, knowledge, and deep personal reflection. This is not just a debate about religion. It is a journey of searching for truth that changes a person's life at a prestigious university in Seoul, South Korea. A senior pastor named Samuel, a 53-year-old man, was known as a firm and highly respected religious figure. With a deep understanding of Christianity, he was often invited to speak at interfaith discussions. However, behind his extensive knowledge, he carried a strong curiosity about other religions, especially Islam, a faith he had always viewed with skepticism and various misconceptions. One day, the university organized an interfaith dialogue event, bringing together students from different backgrounds. It was there that he met Ain Kim, an 18-year-old student who had converted to Islam just a year earlier. Despite her young age, she was known for her intelligence, calm presence, and deep understanding of Islam. At first, Pastor Samuel barely paid attention to her, but when she spoke, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. In Islam, the oneness of God is the foundation of everything. There is no intermediary between a person and the Creator. That is what makes me feel truly close to Him, she said, her voice steady yet full of conviction. Sitting among the panelists, Pastor Samuel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. But doesn't the concept of God in Islam seem too simplistic? How can humans comprehend divine wisdom without an intermediary? Ain smiled gently. That simplicity is exactly what shows His perfection. God does not need an intermediary to hear His servants. It is not about making the concept simple. It is about truly understanding the oneness of God. A deep silence filled the room. The participants slowly realized that this was not just an ordinary debate. It was a profound clash of beliefs, an intellectual exchange that carried weight far beyond the event itself. After the discussion ended, Pastor Samuel found himself unable to shake the thoughts that had taken root in his mind. Unable to suppress his curiosity, he invited Ain to continue their conversation in the university park. This time, there was no audience, but their discussion became even more intense. Why? Pastor Samuel asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Why would a young Korean girl like you choose Islam, especially in a country where it is so often misunderstood? Ain lowered her gaze for a moment before answering. Because Islam gave me logical answers. And most importantly, it brought peace to my heart. I used to be like you, full of questions. But when I read a certain chapter of the Holy Book and understood its meaning, I felt as if I had finally found home. Pastor Samuel remained silent. He had not expected such a deep and meaningful response from someone so young. A curiosity began to stir within him, but he was still bound by the beliefs he had held onto for so long. However, behind his composed exterior, something had started to change, an unspoken realization that truth is not proven through arguments alone, but through understanding and sincerity. For Pastor Samuel, this conversation was no longer just an academic discussion. Ain's words had started to chip away at the walls of belief he had built for decades. And this was only the beginning. After their first conversation, Samuel couldn't stop thinking about what Ain had said. Her words kept echoing in his mind, especially her description of the oneness of God as simple yet perfect. It unsettled him. As someone who had studied theology for years, he had rarely felt the need to explore another faith in such depth. But now, something inside him was restless. A few days later, Pastor Samuel invited Ain to a private discussion in the university library. He wanted an open debate, not to challenge her faith, but to seek answers for the growing curiosity that had taken hold of him. Ain arrived, her face calm and composed. She wore a simple light blue headscarf, her presence exuding quiet confidence. She smiled politely, fully aware that this discussion would not be easy. "Thank you for coming, Ain," Pastor Samuel said, gesturing toward the chair in front of him. "Gladly, Pastor," Ain replied as she sat down, carefully placing a few small books on the table, among them, a translation of the Quran and references on interfaith dialogue. Without hesitation, Samuel began the discussion. "I still can't understand how someone like you, a young girl born and raised in Korea, surrounded by its dominant culture and religion, could accept the concept of Tawhid in Islam. Isn't the concept of the Trinity in our religion more complex and comprehensive in explaining the relationship between God and humanity?" Ain smiled and lowered her gaze for a moment before responding. "I understand how the Trinity is interpreted in Christianity. But when I read a specific chapter from the Quran, everything became clear to me. Say, He is Allah, the one and only. Allah, the eternal refuge. He either begets nor is He begotten. And there is none equal to Him. This verse offers an absolute understanding of the oneness of God, without the complexities of other theological explanations." Pastor Samuel nodded slowly but pressed further. "But doesn't such a belief make God feel distant? In our faith, Jesus is the bridge between humanity and God." Ain's smile remained, but this time there was a quiet determination in her eyes. "In Islam, God is never far away. In fact, we can speak to Him directly through prayer, without any intermediaries. Every human being has a direct connection to their Creator. I felt that closeness for the first time when I read the opening chapter of the Quran during prayer." The debate grew more intense. Pastor Samuel leaned forward, his voice serious. "So, according to Islam, Jesus is not the Son of God?" Ain remained composed. "In Islam, Jesus is one of the most honored prophets. He was born miraculously from the Virgin Mary. But he is not the Son of God. The Quran beautifully describes his birth in Surah Maryam. God created Jesus just as He created Adam, without a father. But he was still human, not divine." Samuel was momentarily speechless. He had not expected Islam to hold such deep reverence for Jesus, even from a different perspective. Taking a deep breath, he tried to compose his thoughts. The discussion was starting to affect him in ways he hadn't anticipated. "Then how does Islam view salvation?" he asked, his curiosity now mixed with something deeper. Ain's voice was gentle yet firm. "Islam teaches that salvation is not based on faith alone but also on righteous actions. God is most merciful and most just, but humans must take responsibility for their choices. There is no concept of inherited sin in Islam. Every person is born pure and is accountable for their own deeds." A heavy silence filled the room. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment. Something about Ain's words resonated deep within him, even though he tried to resist it. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke again. "But isn't Islam often misunderstood as a harsh religion?" Ain nodded. "That's exactly why this dialogue is so important, Pastor. Many people judge Islam only through negative portrayals, without ever understanding its true essence. But at its core, Islam is a religion of mercy. Prophet Muhammad was sent as a mercy to the entire world. Silence settled between them. Pastor Samuel sat still, lost in thought. Pastor Samuel stared out the window at the campus garden, his mind restless. It wasn't because he had lost the debate. It was because he had discovered a gap in his own beliefs, a gap he had never noticed before. "Why are you so sure?" Pastor Samuel finally asked. Ain met his gaze and answered softly, "Because I feel it in my heart. Islam gives me a peace I have never known before, not because I wish to rebel against tradition or culture, but because I have found the truth in it." Pastor Samuel remained silent. For the first time in his life, something was shaking the foundation of his faith, not through forceful arguments, but through the quiet conviction of a young girl's heart. And this debate had just reached its most significant turning point. The discussion room in the campus library felt unnervingly still after the long exchange between Pastor Samuel and Ain. Yet, her words continued to echo in his mind, unsettling beliefs he had once held without question. In front of her, he tried to maintain his composure, but deep inside, waves of doubt were beginning to rise. "Why are you so calm while discussing all this?" Pastor Samuel finally broke the silence. Ain smiled gently. "Because I'm not trying to win a debate. I'm simply sharing the truth I found." Her simple response weighed heavily on Pastor Samuel's mind. He lowered his head, then asked again, "But how can you be so sure Islam is the right path? Didn't you ever hesitate to leave behind your previous beliefs?" Ain took a deep breath before replying. "Of course, I had doubts, especially in the beginning. But the more I learned, the more my questions were answered. Islam is not just a set of rituals or dogma, it's a deeply logical and compassionate way of life. And in it, I found a peace that I had never felt before." The word peace struck Pastor Samuel deeply. He thought back to the times he had once felt serenity in his worship. But as the years passed, his prayers had become more of a routine, empty, mechanical. Could it be that this young girl had found something he himself had lost? "And what does Islam say about Jesus?" he asked, his voice softer than before. "That question still lingers in my heart." Ain nodded. "In Islam, Jesus is a noble prophet. He was born miraculously from Mary, without a father, and he brought the message of monotheism to the children of Israel. But he is not God, nor the Son of God. It is Allah who granted him miracles." Ain spoke with unwavering certainty, and Pastor Samuel fell into silence once more. He felt an instinct to argue, but her reasoning was too firm, too clear. He recalled various verses from the Bible that he had studied throughout his life. Then, one particular verse came to mind, one that made him tremble. In the Gospel, Jesus himself had said, "The Father is greater than I." Pastor Samuel had always interpreted this verse symbolically. But now, Ain's words forced him to reconsider. She didn't press him further. Instead, she let the weight of the discussion settle in his mind. Days passed after their debate, yet Pastor Samuel could not sleep well. The conversation haunted him. He found himself rereading his Bible with new eyes. And for the first time, he also opened the translation of the Quran that Ain had left on the table that day. The more he read, the more he felt an overwhelming turmoil within his soul. One quiet night, inside an empty church, he sat alone on an old wooden bench. The prayers that once flowed effortlessly from his lips now faltered. He began to wonder if he had truly understood God's message all this time. "O God, if you are indeed the one, as Ain said, show me the straight path," he muttered. Though his tongue still felt heavy pronouncing the word Allah, his heart was sincere in seeking the truth. Not long after, he contacted Ain again, asking to meet. This time, they met in a quiet corner of the campus park. Pastor Samuel looked different. His face was weary, yet there was a newfound sincerity in his expression. "Ain, I have read the translation of the Quran," he said softly, "and I can't deny that there is something in it, something deep. But I also feel confused and afraid. How could I, a pastor, begin to doubt my own beliefs?" Ain smiled gently. "You don't need to be afraid, pastor. Searching for the truth sometimes leads us into uncertainty, but sincerity will always guide you." Pastor Samuel lowered his head, trying to suppress the emotions rising within him. "I don't know what to do," he admitted. "It feels like there are two great forces battling inside me." Ain looked at him with understanding. "Sometimes, the greatest battle is within our own hearts. But believe me, God always guides those who sincerely seek the truth." Pastor Samuel's eyes began to fill with tears. He felt as though the walls of old beliefs, which had stood strong for so long, were beginning to crumble. But amidst the collapse, he also felt something new, a glimmer of hope. The following days marked the biggest turning point in his life. He began reading the Quran more deeply, watching interfaith discussions, and even, in secret, visiting a mosque on the outskirts of the city. He did all of this without anyone from his community knowing. But his inner struggles soon had real-world consequences. Some of his colleagues noticed a change in his demeanor. They began avoiding him, and whispers of deviation started circulating. "Pastor Samuel, are you considering something serious?" one of his fellow pastors asked him one day as they sat together in the church. Pastor Samuel didn't answer immediately. After a long pause, he simply nodded. "Be careful," his colleague warned in a worried tone. "You know what the consequences will be if you leave the church." Pastor Samuel smiled bitterly. "I know, but sometimes seeking the truth requires sacrifice." His inner turmoil reached its peak when he found himself sitting alone in his office. His eyes moved from the small cross on his desk to the Quran lying beside it. For the first time in his life, he faced an unbearable dilemma, whether to remain in his comfort zone or to step onto the path he had long been searching for. "Am I ready to lose everything for the truth?" he whispered. At that moment, his phone vibrated. Ain had sent him a short message. "If the pastor needs someone to talk to, I'm at the mosque near the campus this afternoon." A simple message, yet it felt like a sign. Pastor Samuel stared at the Quran in front of him. Slowly, he picked it up and stood. A great decision was forming within him, but was he truly ready to take it? That afternoon, the sky over Seoul was overcast, as if mirroring the storm in Pastor Samuel's heart. He stood in front of a small mosque near the campus, gripping the translated Quran tightly in his hands. A subtle tremor ran through his chest as he stepped through the large gate, adorned with intricate calligraphy that seemed to soothe his soul. Inside, the mosque radiated an overwhelming sense of peace. The scent of freshly cleaned carpets lingered in the air, and the soft voices of children reciting the Quran filled the space. In the corner, Ain sat quietly, her face as calm as ever. When Pastor Samuel entered the mosque, Ain stood up and greeted him with a warm smile. "Pastor, thank you for coming," she said softly. Pastor Samuel nodded. "I need to talk. There are many things weighing on my mind." They walked to the mosque's back garden, where cherry blossom trees were just beginning to bloom. Sitting beneath the delicate pink petals, Pastor Samuel stared straight ahead, as if gathering the courage to open his heart. "I have read the Quran, Ain, and the things that once felt unclear are now slowly becoming clear," he admitted. "The concept of Tawhid, the stories of the prophets, even Islam's view of Jesus, it all makes sense." But then, he paused, struggling with the emotions surging inside him. "I'm afraid of losing everything, my position, my church, my community, even my identity." Ain lowered her head briefly before speaking. "I understand, Father. But isn't the truth more valuable than mere comfort?" Her words struck him right in the chest. Pastor Samuel knew the answer, but saying it out loud felt unbearably heavy. "I've been a pastor for almost half my life," he whispered. "How can I just leave everything behind?" Ain smiled gently. Do you remember the story of Prophet Ibrahim? He left behind the beliefs of his people for the truth he found. And see how Allah guided him. A long silence followed. Finally, in a soft voice, Pastor Samuel said, I feel like my heart is being led in this direction, but I need time. Ain nodded. Take all the time you need. Allah never forces, He only guides. Weeks passed. Pastor Samuel lived in deep inner turmoil. He began withdrawing from the church, reflecting on every verse of the Bible, comparing it to the Quran. But as time went on, peace slowly began to fill the emptiness in his heart. Until finally, one quiet night it happened. In the silence of his office, not in a church, not in an official place of worship, but in a simple room where he often reflected, he prostrated on the floor for the first time in his life. "O God," his voice trembled. "If Islam is truly your straight path, then I submit myself to it. I am ready to lose everything, as long as I do not lose you." Tears fell freely down his cheeks. A sense of relief, unlike anything he had ever felt before, washed over him, like the burden of years had finally melted away. The next day, at the same mosque where he had met Ain, Pastor Samuel recited the Shahida. There were only a few witnesses, Ain, the Imam, and a couple of others. "I testify that there is no God but Allah, and I testify that Muhammad is his messenger." The atmosphere was silent, yet profoundly sacred. Tears streamed down his face, not tears of regret, but of joy. He had finally found the light he had been searching for. After that, his life changed completely. He lost his position in the church. Some friends distanced themselves from him. His family struggled to accept his decision. But despite all that he lost, he gained something far greater, peace. A peace he had never known before. One evening, after praying Maghrib at the mosque, Ain approached him. "How do you feel now?" she asked. Pastor Samuel smiled sincerely. There was a quiet calm in his expression. "For the first time in my life, I feel truly at peace." Ain grinned. "That's guidance. Not everyone has the courage to take such a big step, Pastor. But you did." Pastor Samuel shook his head gently. "Thank you for guiding me to this point." Ain's smile widened. "It wasn't me who guided you. It was Allah. I was just a small intermediary." The message of this story. This story teaches us that the journey to truth is often filled with obstacles and doubts. But for those who sincerely seek, Allah always opens the way. Stepping out of one's comfort zone in search of the light of truth is never easy, but the result is true peace. May this story be a reminder that guidance is the greatest gift for those willing to open their hearts. Welcome to a story that takes us on a journey filled with intellectual depth and emotional insight. This is not just a debate between two brilliant minds but a search for the meaning of life, one often overshadowed by the dazzling world of academic knowledge. The setting is a prestigious university in London, where an intense discussion is about to unfold. The main hall was packed with hundreds of students, lecturers, and researchers who had gathered for a highly anticipated scientific forum titled, "The Existence of God, Science versus Faith." The event had drawn immense attention, as it featured two distinguished figures from the academic world, both highly respected, yet holding opposing views. On the left side of the podium stood Leonard Strauss, a renowned atheist philosopher from Germany. Around 50 years old, he was a rationalist thinker known for examining the concept of God through pure logic and modern science. With a sharp gaze and a firm demeanor, Leonard had authored dozens of controversial books that had sparked debates among both supporters and critics alike. On the right side, sitting quietly, was a young researcher named Claire. Wearing a hijab, she was a neuroscience specialist from Turkey. At just 32 years old, she had already made groundbreaking contributions in the study of the connection between the human brain and spirituality. Not only was she highly intelligent, but she also had an extraordinary sense of calm, even in heated debates. Known for her soft-spoken nature and sharp reasoning, she sat composedly, exuding an air of quiet confidence. Applause thundered through the hall as the moderator introduced the two figures. But as soon as Leonard stood up to speak, the room fell into silence. With a confident expression, he scanned the audience before beginning. "I'm not here to attack anyone's beliefs," Leonard declared, his voice deep and steady. "But let's talk about the facts. For centuries, humans have created the concept of God out of fear, fear of the unknown, fear of what they could not understand. However, as science advances, more and more mysteries of the universe are being unraveled, without any need to involve supernatural beings. So, the question is simple. If everything can be explained by the laws of nature, then what need is there for God?" Some participants nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Leonard continued, presenting a series of philosophical and scientific arguments. He spoke about the Big Bang Theory, evolution, and neurological studies on human consciousness. His words flowed effortlessly, as if carefully designed to dismantle the beliefs of anyone listening. A brief silence followed. All eyes turned to Claire, waiting for her response. She remained poised, her face calm, not with the tension of confrontation, but with the serenity of someone prepared to engage in thoughtful discussion. "Thank you, Leonard," she began softly. "I respect your perspective, as I do every thought that emerges from the pursuit of truth." She then asked, "Leonard, can you see or measure consciousness directly? If something cannot be measured, does that mean it doesn't exist?" Leonard smirked slightly. "Of course not. Take gravity, for example. It's invisible, yet its effects can be measured." Claire nodded. "Exactly. But what about love? Trust? Even human consciousness itself? These are real, yet science struggles to measure them completely. Does that make them any less significant?" The atmosphere in the hall began to shift. Some participants whispered among themselves, as Claire's words stirred something deeper within them. "The problem," Claire continued, "is that while science is extraordinary at explaining mechanisms, it often fails to explain meaning. Why do we seek meaning? Why are humans different from other species, driven by an existential urge to understand the reason for their existence? Doesn't this suggest something greater than just the laws of nature?" Leonard hesitated, as if considering her words. But before he could respond, Claire continued, "I am a neuroscientist. I study the human brain. I understand how neurons fire, how electrical signals move between cells, how emotions arise from chemical processes. But something profound happens when I observe the brain of a person who prays or meditates. I find something that science cannot fully explain, a state of deep peace that not only affects the mind but also enhances the physical functions of the body. Is this merely a biological reaction, or is there something greater at work?" A tense silence filled the hall, not the tension of conflict, but the weight of the question itself. Leonard frowned slightly, as if searching for a logical flaw to counter her argument. But before he could respond, Claire continued, her voice now carrying a more emotional undertone. "I did not come here to impose a belief," she said gently. "I only want to invite all of us to consider that not everything fits neatly into a purely rational framework. Sometimes, the greatest truths lie beyond what we can see or measure. And perhaps, that is where God is present." The hall remained silent, as if everyone was absorbing the depth of her words. On the podium, Leonard Strauss stood tall. His face showed a mixture of admiration and challenge. He was not someone easily shaken by emotional arguments, yet he recognized that Claire's words were not mere rhetoric. They were a direct challenge to the very foundation of his worldview. With a faint smile, Leonard stepped forward to the microphone. "I have to admit," he said, his tone composed, "you speak in a way that touches the hearts of the audience. But let's return to the core of this debate. You claim that science has not yet explained the meaning of life. But does the absence of an answer automatically prove the existence of God? Some members of the audience nodded in agreement with Leonard's reasoning. But Claire remained unfazed, her eyes steady as she listened. Leonard continued, I am not someone who denies the wonder of life. But just because there are gaps in human knowledge does not mean we must insert the concept of God into them. This is what we call the God of the gaps argument, an old idea that assumes anything science cannot yet explain must be attributed to divine power. But history has shown us that science continues to advance, solving mysteries that were once thought to be supernatural. Some students took notes, while others sat deep in thought. Claire didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let Leonard's words settle in the air before finally speaking. Leonard, she said softly, I understand your perspective. And I agree, science has unraveled many mysteries of the universe. But there's something interesting. The deeper we delve into science, the more we discover that the universe operates with astonishing precision, almost as if it were designed by an intelligence far beyond our comprehension. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. Take the cosmological constant, for example, she continued. If its value were even slightly different, life as we know it would not be possible. Then, consider the genetic code in human DNA. It functions like a language, a carefully structured system of information. Throughout the history of science, has complex, meaningful information ever appeared on its own, without an intelligent source behind it? Leonard let out a quiet sigh, clearly unconvinced but momentarily at a loss for words. And one more thing, Claire added, her voice now tinged with personal emotion. When my mother was diagnosed with brain cancer 4 years ago, doctors told us she had no more than 6 months to live. But I saw her pray every day with extraordinary calm. I was a neuroscientist, a researcher. I understood the statistics, the medical prognosis. And yet, despite everything, my mother made a full recovery. The hall was completely still. Science called it spontaneous remission. But deep down, I knew there was something more at work. A hush fell over the room. Claire's story had introduced an entirely new dimension to the discussion, one that transcended mere intellectual arguments. But Leonard, ever the seasoned philosopher, was not one to surrender easily. Claire, he said, his tone softer now, I am truly happy to hear that your mother recovered. But this is precisely the issue. Human emotions often cloud objectivity. We want to believe in a higher power because it provides comfort in times of fear and uncertainty. That is why the concept of God is so powerful, not because of evidence, but because it soothes the human mind. Claire smiled. That's a classic argument, Leonard. But think about this. Does the fact that something brings peace automatically make it false? Or could it be that this very peace is a sign that truth aligns with the deepest nature of humanity? The discussion was intensifying. But unlike a typical heated debate, this was beginning to resemble a profound dialogue between two brilliant minds, both striving to uncover the essence of truth, though from opposite directions. Suddenly, a student raised his hand. The moderator gestured for him to speak. Excuse me. Claire, the student said nervously. How do you, as a scientist, balance faith and logic? Aren't they often in conflict? Claire smiled warmly. That's a great question, she said. I have always believed that science and faith are not enemies. Science tells us how the universe works, while faith helps us understand why it exists. They are like two sides of the same coin, they complement each other. In fact, some of the greatest scientists in history, like Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein, believed in a higher intelligence behind the order of the universe. Leonard chuckled, not mockingly, but with genuine curiosity. Einstein did not believe in a personal God like in the Semitic religions, he remarked. He acknowledged an intelligent force, but not in the way most religious traditions describe it. Claire nodded. That is true. But even Einstein, one of the greatest scientific minds, could not ignore the profound order that governs the cosmos. The debate had reached a crucial turning point. a true meeting ground between science and faith. Leonard, who had initially been eager to argue his points, now seemed more careful in his approach. Instead of merely challenging Claire, he was trying to understand her perspective. But the real conflict emerged when Leonard posed a question that encapsulated his entire line of reasoning. So, Claire, how do you explain suffering in this world if God exists, if He is all-loving and all-just? Why do children starve? Why do wars rage? And why do natural disasters destroy lives? For me, this is the strongest argument against the concept of God. A hush fell over the room. It was a classic question, one that had troubled believers for centuries. Claire remained silent for a few moments before responding softly. It's a difficult question, even for believers. But think about this, Leonard. Can the meaning of goodness exist without the presence of evil? Does courage have any significance without fear? This world is not paradise. It is a place of trials. She continued. Suffering is not proof of the absence of God, but rather a part of a system that grants humans free will. Leonard looked at Claire, his expression softer now. So you believe suffering is part of a greater plan? That it's not because God is cruel, but because true meaning is only found when humans have the freedom to choose? The debate had now shifted from a battle of logic to a profound discussion on the very meaning of life and human existence. But before Leonard could respond, the moderator raised a hand. The main session is over. We will continue after a short break. The audience slowly dispersed, some heading for the exit, others staying behind, still deep in thought. Leonard and Claire locked eyes, no longer as debaters, but as fellow seekers of truth. Leonard walked over to Claire. I have to admit, this isn't the debate I expected. I thought I would be facing typical theological arguments. But you bring a different approach. Claire smiled. That's because I'm not here to win, Leonard. I'm here to have a dialogue. Leonard fell silent, as if deep in thought. For the first time in his life, he felt a crack forming in the rigid wall of logic he had built around himself. The debate had reached its peak, but the journey toward answers was far from over. The atmosphere in the hall was still heavy, even as the break began. Many in the audience were lost in thought, replaying the arguments in their minds. Some students debated passionately, while others sat quietly, contemplating. Claire walked to the corner of the hall, pouring herself a glass of water. Her breath was heavy, not from physical exhaustion, but from the weight of the discussion. She realized that this was more than a philosophical debate. It was about beliefs, life experiences, and the truths that had shaped her. Before she could compose herself, heavy footsteps approached. Leonard stood beside her, his expression still puzzled. You've really made me think, Leonard admitted as he sipped his coffee. Claire smiled, though exhaustion was evident on her face. I think that's the point of these discussions, Leonard. It's not about who wins, but about who is willing to think deeper. Leonard chuckled. I didn't expect this debate to feel so personal. Usually, I deal with people who just repeat the same arguments over and over. But you're different. Before Claire could respond, a middle-aged woman suddenly approached them. Her face was pale, yet her eyes held a quiet strength. She introduced herself as Maria, a sociology researcher from a local university. I'm sorry to interrupt, Maria said, but I have a question. How do you both see the role of religion in dealing with major trauma? I lost my child in an accident last year, and I'm still searching for meaning in it. Claire saw the pain in Maria's eyes. This was not a question to be answered lightly. Leonard hesitated, looking slightly uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke. Maria, as a philosopher, I believe that humans are constantly searching for meaning. But sometimes, that meaning is simply a way to make sense of the chaos in the world. His words, though intellectually sound, felt cold, like a sharp blade cutting through Maria's grief. Her expression hardened, but she waited for Claire's response. Claire looked at Maria deeply and spoke gently. I won't claim to know the exact reason why tragedies happen. But I believe that wisdom exists in every wound, even if we are too broken to see it right away." Maria's eyes filled with tears. Claire continued, "Sadness can be a bridge to a deeper understanding of love and sacrifice." Tears began to stream down Maria's face, not from pain, but from the relief of feeling understood. "And one more thing," Claire added softly. "Sometimes faith doesn't give us all the answers, but it gives us the strength to keep searching." Maria nodded, her lips trembling. For the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of peace. Leonard watched the exchange in silence. He had come to the debate to challenge belief, yet now he found himself questioning his own certainty. The conversation had shifted from logic to something deeper, something human. The debate was far from over, but the journey of understanding had just begun. We don't need complex answers. We just need to know that there is something greater than this pain, something that gives hope. Leonard looked at Claire with a different perspective this time. He began to see that Claire's argument was not just about logic but about a deeper human connection. When the break ended and the participants began to return to their seats, the moderator announced that the next session would be more intense, delving into the realm of morality and human responsibility. Claire and Leonard returned to the stage, but this time, the feeling was different. It was no longer a competition but a dialogue between two contrasting schools of thought. Leonard started the session with a piercing question. "Claire, if God exists, why does human morality vary? Doesn't that prove that ethics are merely the result of social agreements rather than universal laws?" Claire nodded slowly and then answered, "It is true that moral standards can differ across cultures, but look deeper. There are fundamental values that are nearly universal: honesty, love, the prohibition of killing without just cause. Where does this moral intuition come from, if not from something greater than mere social constructs?" Leonard thought for a moment, then chimed in. "Or could it be the result of evolution? The instinct to protect our own species helps humans survive." Claire smiled faintly. "Maybe, but can evolution explain selfless sacrifice? What about people who risk their lives for strangers? This is no longer about survival, but about something deeper." The discussion heated up again, but this time it was more philosophical. Claire did not present religion as mere dogma but as a source of morality and meaning that binds humanity together. However, the main conflict truly erupted when Leonard finally revealed his personal struggle. 12 years ago," he said quietly, "I lost my sister in a house fire. She was only 8 years old. I once prayed, Claire. I once believed that there was a God who heard me. But when I stood in front of the rubble of that house, looking at my sister's charred body, I knew that no one had heard my prayers." The whole hall fell silent. This was not just an argument. It was Leonard's deepest wound, the reason he abandoned faith and chose cold logic. Claire lowered her head, holding back her emotions. She could feel the burden Leonard had carried for years. "Leonard," Claire said in a trembling voice, "I can't imagine how painful it is to experience such a loss. But I believe God is not a shield from all tragedies. He is the place we return to after everything ends. This world is not the final destination. It is just a bridge, and sometimes we must cross a bridge full of wounds to reach our true home." Leonard stared at Claire for a long time. For the first time in his debating career, he didn't have a quick reply. There was something in Claire's words that penetrated his logical defenses. Before the atmosphere became too emotional, the moderator stepped in with a serious expression. "Sorry, but we have to end today's session. However, due to the overwhelming response from the audience, the university has decided to extend this debate into an open forum next week." Applause filled the hall, but Claire and Leonard just looked at each other, realizing that this debate was far from over. In fact, it was just the beginning. As the participants began leaving the room, Claire sat for a moment on the now empty stage. She knew this discussion was never about winning an argument. It was about touching hearts, even those that had been tightly closed for so long. Leonard walked toward the exit, his usual cold logic lingering. But before stepping out the door, he turned and said, "Next week, Claire." "I'm not done." Claire smiled. "Neither am I." The following week, the same hall was once again packed with people. But this time, the atmosphere was different. There was tension, not from rivalry but from the collective understanding that today's discussion was not about arguments. It was about wounds, beliefs, and a search for the deepest meaning of humanity. Claire arrived early, sitting alone in the front row, flipping through her notes, though she hardly needed them. What she had prepared was not just facts or theories but the courage to speak from the heart. Not long after, Leonard arrived. His appearance was slightly different. He was no longer wearing the formal attire he usually did. Instead, he wore a simple shirt, as if wanting to strip away formalities and speak more honestly. They both smiled at each other, not as rivals, but as two souls seeking understanding. The moderator opened the session with a calm voice. "Today, we are no longer discussing who is right or wrong. This is a podium for honest reflection." Looking at the now silent audience, he continued, "Every human being carries wounds. Some choose to cover them with logic, while others seek meaning within them. I am not here to impose beliefs. I am here to share hope." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "I understand why many lose their way after tragedy. I have been there. Losing my father made me ask the same question: if God exists, why did he allow this to happen? But in my search, I found that it's not about avoiding suffering, it's about what we do after it." Some people in the hall looked visibly moved. Among them was Maria, the woman who had spoken in the previous session. Her eyes glistened with tears, but this time, there was something different, an understanding, a flicker of hope. Maria, the woman who had asked about trauma last week, nodded slowly, her eyes brimming with tears. Then it was Leonard's turn. He stood up, took a deep breath, and spoke with rare honesty. "I came here initially just to prove that religion is nothing more than an illusion, a concept created by humans to feel safe. But Claire challenged me to think deeper. Maybe all this time, I've been too busy building walls around myself, walls of logic, walls of doubt, so that I wouldn't have to face my pain." The hall was silent. This was no longer a debate, it was a confession. "My sister died," Leonard continued. "And I didn't just lose her, I lost myself. I abandoned all things spiritual because, to me, the world was unfair. But after all these discussions, I realized something. Maybe life isn't about searching for absolute justice. Maybe it's about how we keep standing, even when everything around us falls apart." He lowered his head for a moment before speaking again. "I won't stand here and say I suddenly believe in God. But I've learned one thing: sometimes, what we need is not a definitive answer. Sometimes, we just need to know that we're not alone in our search." The room erupted in applause, not out of victory, but out of sincerity. Claire stepped closer to Leonard and said softly, "And you are not alone, Leonard. All of us here share the same questions. And that's what makes us human." The atmosphere in the hall shifted. There were no winners or losers, just two perspectives that had finally found common ground. Not an absolute agreement, but an understanding. Maria stood from her seat, her voice trembling. "Thank you. I think, today, I found a little peace." Leonard smiled for the first time, without sarcasm, without the cold shield of logic. Claire closed the session with a simple yet profound statement. "Sometimes the greatest debates are not about winning or losing, but about having the courage to open your heart." As the participants began to leave the hall, Claire and Leonard remained seated at the edge of the stage. They talked casually, not about philosophy or faith, but about simple things. No longer as opponents, but as fellow travelers in the search for meaning. Before they parted ways, Leonard turned to Claire and said, "You know, Claire, I may not fully believe yet, But you've made me want to keep searching. Claire smiled warmly. That's more than enough, Leonard. They shook hands, and for the first time in a long time, Leonard felt lighter. The moral of this story is simple. The search for meaning is not about finding all the answers, it's about the journey itself. Every human carries the weight of loss, the burden of unanswered questions. But true strength does not come from certainty. It comes from the courage to keep searching. Differences in belief should not divide us. They should be a bridge to understanding. Because in genuine dialogue, we don't just exchange words, we find pieces of ourselves. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Life is not about having all the answers. It's about learning how to move forward, even when the path feels dark.